All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jennifer Morris. I'm the Director of Customer Success here at Madcap Software. I want to thank everyone for joining today. We're going to jump right in and get started. Today's session is all about how to integrate technical documentation into your overall content strategy. So the idea of technical documentation has been around for some time, but the discipline of overall content strategy and content design is still fairly new. So today we want to talk about how to blend these two worlds together and how to align the content so that it meets the needs of your users. We're also going to be focusing on takeaways about creating basic content strategy and how to integrate technical docs into it, including the importance of things like style guides, certain content design considerations, measuring metrics, and also accessibility considerations. And I'm so very excited to welcome our guest today, Adriana Harper, Manager of Digital Content at H&R Block Canada. And for over 15 years, she's been involved in technical content development and strategy. And at present, Adriana and her team focus on empowering their end users to understand and engage with H&R Block's suite of digital tax products and services using the principles that we're going to touch on today. So welcome, Adriana. We are so thrilled to have you here today. I'm so happy that you're here. I'm going to be turning it over to you in a second, but for everybody else on the webinar, just want to remind everyone about two quick items of business that we always like to review quickly. Again, this webinar is going to be recorded, so if you have to jump out early, not to worry. When it's done, we're going to be sending a link to the recording to everybody that's registered, and it will be up on our website. There is a question panel in the GoToWebinar console, and I would encourage you all to use that as a place to ask questions as we go through. At the end of the session, we're going to do our best to get to them. We'll get to as many as we can. We may not have time to cover them all, but whatever we can't cover, we'll go ahead and follow up with a question and answer document to everybody that's registered as well. So with that, again, welcome, Adriana. I'm so happy to have you here today, and I know you got a lot to talk about, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jennifer, for that kind introduction. I'd like to welcome everyone here today to this session. I really appreciate everyone spending some of your valuable time with me today. As mentioned, my name is Adriana Harper, and I work at H&R Block Canada. I manage a team of 6 content professionals, including technical writers, user interface writers, and translators. Among other things, our team handles over 1,200 pieces of technical documentation in a multilingual, multi-product online help center. We write and maintain over 1,000 screens of bilingual content across 4 digital products, and we provide release notes and support documentation to our internal and external users to tie all of our digital offerings together. I have over 15 years of content experience wearing a variety of hats, including as an online instructor of a TechCom certificate program, a product manager, technical writer, learning and development designer, user interface content writer, and a content strategist. So as Jennifer said, today I'd like to spend some time talking to all of you about how to integrate technical documentation into a content strategy, combining the best of both disciplines in a way that aligns all of your content with what your users expect and what your company at an enterprise level is delivering. Before we get started, I want to ground our discussions and the use of the term technical documentation. There's a lot of different flavors of technical documentation in the industry. So when I'm talking about technical documentation today, I'd like to be clear that I'm including any type of technical documentation that someone might produce, including but not limited to user manuals, release notes, help center content, explainer videos, quick start guides, and everything in between. So with that, let's get started. The discipline of technical documentation has been around for a very long time. In fact, at its most basic level, some of the first pieces of technical documentation were in the form of patents, and the idea of patents date all the way back to 500 BC. More recently, one of the first instances of technical documentation as a user manual was created in 1949 by Joseph Chaplin to support a computer that he developed. So technical documentation has a long and storied history. By contrast, the discipline of content strategy is still fairly new on the world stage. It broke into the market around 1990 from a consultancy in Minnesota called Brain Traffic. And although more and more companies are starting to adopt a content strategy in various forms, it's still something that's often done off the side of someone's desk, sometimes even as a second or third thought. So how do we blend a discipline with such a long history of technical focus into this new, more modern strategic endeavor? And in my opinion, the key is to think differently about technical documentation as a whole and to understand that it's evolved significantly over the past 50 years. This will help us see how it can now fit into the practice of content strategy. When I started in technical documentation 15 years ago, the discipline largely focused on creating long and sometimes very complex user guides to help a specific targeted group of people interact with a specific targeted group piece of software. The discipline was also seen as a bit of a bridge between software developers and users. Often it was a technical writer's job to review the documentation that software developers produced and then write release notes or other forms of helpful communication based on that documentation in plain English so that a user could understand how a product worked and what features were available. However, over the past decade, the scope of technical documentation has changed significantly and evolved to be a lot more well-rounded. Today, we see it include a lot of different types of writing, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation. The way I see it, it's no longer a standalone profession whose expertise remains limited to complex content, but in fact, it's become much more of a crossover discipline that often finds itself intersecting with marketing content and user interface design. Because of all that crossover, I believe that it's really important to look at technical documentation as something that requires a content strategy. It's not enough to just create technical documents that explain a product's user interface without crossing over into considerations about what other content a company might be putting out or what a user's needs or journey might be when they encounter that documentation. In my opinion, since technical documentation now encompasses so many different types of content and impacts a company's user base on so many different levels, technical documentation now more than ever must be strategically planned, created, implemented, and reviewed. And the best way to achieve all of this on a regular basis is by creating a robust content strategy and then folding technical documentation considerations into it. So how do we accomplish this? Well, a really good place to start is by gaining a fundamental understanding of what content strategy is. The Minnesotan consultancy that I mentioned earlier, Brain Traffic, where many people attribute the start of content strategy as a discipline, have a really great definition for content strategy. They say that content strategy is what connects an organization's content with business goals and user needs through a set of integrated choices between 4 separate but related areas of activity. That's a bit of a mouthful, but we can bring further this definition to life with an image of that content strategy and how its 4 areas of activity are aligned. This quad that you can now see on the screen was also developed by Brain Traffic, and very kindly they have given me their permission to use it throughout my presentation today. The 4 elements that make up the content strategy quad are structure and process as part of systems design, and editorial and experience as part of content design. I'd like to share 2 important considerations when you're looking at this content strategy quad. The first consideration is the setup of the quad itself. Systems design is on the bottom of the quad, but not because it should be considered last. In fact, it should be considered first as the foundation of a robust content strategy. The second consideration is that all the quadrants are intermingled. Although each quadrant stands alone, they all impact each other. The decisions that you make in one will have a significant impact everywhere else. So make sure that when you're working with one of the elements of the quad, you always keep in mind all the other elements in the back of your plan. So with all of that in mind, let's take a closer look at each component. We'll start with the foundation of the quad in systems design. Christina Halverson, Brain Traffic's CEO, says that systems design is the process of defining the architecture, modules, interfaces, and data for a system to satisfy specified requirements. There's two aspects of systems design that we'll consider: structure and process. Structure considerations include information architecture, tags and search methodology, documentation reuse, and documentation delivery. Process considerations include the content's lifecycle, determinations about when content needs to be updated or retired, authoring tools, accountability, usability, and metrics. So now let's take a look at content design. The discipline of content design is even newer to the professional stage than content strategy. It burst on the scene around 2010 from Sarah Richards in the United Kingdom and her team at Content Design London. The foundational principle behind content design is to create smarter content, not more content. And as Sarah says, content design is the process of using data and evidence to give the audience the content they need at the time they need it in a way they expect. There are two elements that we'll have a look at with content design: editorial and experience. Editorial considerations include the mission of the documentation, the audience who will interact with it, the voice and tone that the documentation will use, and brand guidelines that should be followed. Experience considerations include the user's needs and preferences, the customer journey, the document format, accessibility considerations, and content delivery strategies. So now that we're more familiar with these four quadrants of content strategy, the next step is to look at how we can layer technical documentation in. Usability.gov, one of many organizations that also works within the realm of content and user experience, explains that there are 4 strategy steps when it comes to creating sound content. Those 4 steps are planning, creation, delivery, and governance. Each step helps to ensure that documentation is useful, accurate, and governed appropriately. When we combine those 4 steps with Brain Traffic's content strategy quad, we get a visual representation like this. And this visual representation is really helpful because it helps to explain that our best practice approach is to walk through each step in each quadrant and put them all together to create a robust content strategy. The best way that I thought how to explain that this can work is by walking through a case study of my own team. So let me set the stage by giving you a bit of information about where I work. H&R Block Canada, just like H&R Block US, provides multiple solutions to prepare and file taxes every year. My role with H&R Block Canada is primarily with the digital solutions team. In other words, our team creates and delivers online digital solutions for Canadians to do their taxes on their own or with a tax expert's assistance through a virtual interface. Prior to and during every Canadian tax season, these digital products release weekly to accommodate hundreds of changes to federal and provincial tax law on a year-over-year basis and deliver new and updated features and functionality to our user base to make the tax preparation experience as pleasant as possible. Our products and services are depended upon by hundreds of thousands of people across the country. As you can imagine, there are a lot of moving pieces required to do what we do and to do it well. And with over 50 million returns filed over the past 50 years through the H&R Block Canada brand, we have a track record of success to uphold. When I joined the team just over 5 years ago, the digital solutions component of our company was new to the Canadian stage, and there was no content strategy in place to manage the technical documentation that the digital solutions team was producing. Because of that lack of strategy, our team had quite a few challenges on our hands. For starters, when I arrived, the process to produce technical documentation involved 12 steps just to get a single piece of content out the door. In addition, our documentation updates were tied into the software release process, which meant that new or updated documentation was gated by and dependent on development support. There was no governance in place, so there was no way for us to monitor existing content and make sure that it was being kept relevant on a yearly basis. Our documentation wasn't searchable, which made it difficult for users to find what they were looking for. And there were very few metrics available to report on how users were engaging with that documentation, meaning that our team had little to no recourse to figure out what was working and what needed to change. What our team did have on our side was a clear view of where we needed to go next. We needed to find a way to serve technical documentation to all of our Canadian users during tax season in order to support the digital products and services that our company was sending out to the marketplace. We had two user bases to consider: external users who were preparing their own taxes and internal users who were supporting our external user base. We also wanted to tie our work into our company's business goals, which is a great way to provide proof of value that our team is going to bring to the table. The business goal that we chose to align with was one of operational cost savings. We knew that in past support, our support team was overwhelmed by calls during the tax season, and we felt that some of those calls could be solved by implementing strategically created technical documentation. So we proposed that by developing and implementing a content strategy for that technical documentation, we could reduce calls to the support team by 25%. Time would tell if we were right. Our first step was to review previous year's learnings based largely on conversations with our support team members to evaluate what we knew about our users and the existing documentation and give us a place to start. Now, before I jump in with both feet, it's important to note that the process I'm going to share in the next few slides is not an exhaustive representation of all the work we did. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to cover every single question that we asked or every single piece of research that we did. So just as a word of advice to anyone creating their own content strategy, you always want to make sure that you are as exhaustive as possible when you do the research and discovery. Collaborate with anyone and everyone who will listen and ask as many questions as you can think of from every angle possible. The more complete your preparation process is, the more well-rounded your content strategy will be. Okay, without further ado, here's what we did. We started building the foundation of our content strategy, asking questions about systems design in the structure quadrant. The first thing we needed to do was build an information architecture framework so that we could organize and classify our documentation in a way that would make sense to our users. We chose to follow the category element from architect Richard Saul Werman's Latch framework. So we started planning the research that we'd need to do in order to build that framework moving forward. We needed to consider all of the places that our users might expect to have documentation delivered to them. Sorry about that. We needed to consider all of the places our users might expect to have documentation delivered to them, and we chose to look through the lens of our two distinct user bases, external users and internal users, in order to plan those delivery avenues. Our largest group of users were our external users. They were Canadians who were in our tax application, preparing their tax returns and looking for support along the way. We investigated how we could better deliver documentation to those people, and we learned that what those users most wanted was in-application help, links that would keep them in our software and provide them helpful documentation in a non-intrusive manner as they prepared their tax returns. Our second largest group of users were our internal users, our support team members and other H&R Block employees. These internal users were primarily outside our application, looking for documentation to help them support that external user base. So we plan to deliver documentation to them in a fully searchable online knowledge center, organized according to the previously established categorization principles. These internal users also needed access to weekly release notes in order to keep up to date with all the changes our products and services underwent during each tax season. So we started planning how we could communicate those changes on a regular basis. We also needed to plan how we could deliver content in a more agile manner. Removing our dependency on the product release cycle and the development team was key. We explored and selected an option to put all of our documentation in the cloud, empowering our team to be in control of all of the pushing and pulling of updates. With our questions about structure in place, we started to ask questions about process. We started by exploring the life cycle of our technical documentation. Given all the changes that happened before, during, and after each tax season, it was imperative that we kept all our documentation up to date. But the lack of a content catalog of any kind meant that we didn't actually know all of the documentation that existed or what state it was in. So we planned to do a content audit in order to identify and document existing content and facilitate the prioritization of updates moving forward. We took full accountability for all the technical documentation that H&R Block Canada was producing. We communicated internally that our team was responsible for planning, creating, delivering, and governing the content, making sure that everyone knew to whom they could come if they had questions or feedback. We collaborated with anyone and everyone who would listen, sharing our ideas and gathering ideas from those around us. And finally, we needed to implement a way to gather metrics moving forward. We wanted to understand more about who was using our documentation and what they were doing with it. So we planned to implement Google Analytics so that we could capture measurements about page views, time on page and bounce rate, keywords and corresponding search results, incoming traffic or search sources, etc. We also plan to implement a survey to gather free-form feedback from our users. We wanted to provide them with a direct channel to our team and a personalized avenue to tell us what was working and what was not. Now that we had our plans in place, we began to create the structure of the documentation. Based on the work we did in the planning step, we knew that we were going to create an information architecture framework built around the principle of categorization to organize our documentation. To help us build those categories, we started by reviewing common Canadian tax language, other competitors' software, and our own tax applications navigation structure. We also had a look at the actual words and categories that our clients used when they were interacting with our support team. Next, we applied the categorical considerations that Lisa Maria Martin talks about in her book, Everyday Information Architecture, that categorization should be shaped by user needs, business goals, the current state of content, and the strategic future state of content. So adding in all of those pieces to our information architecture puzzle, and based on the results of all of our user research, we built the main categories for our documentation and began to slot in content accordingly. We also established an approach that our documentation should all be housed in one place, but delivered through multiple access points. This matched up nicely with our research about delivery, also done during our previous planning step, when we determined that external users were looking for documentation in the application and internal users were looking for that same documentation, but outside our application. Another way to look at it was for us to better understand that no two users were looking for content in exactly the same way, even though they were likely looking for the same content. For example, what one person might search for with a keyword of T4, which is the Canadian equivalent of a W2, someone else might look for using a search phrase like, how do I report my income? And a third person might expect to see a link on screen from that T4 page in the tax application out to helpful documentation. We would deliver these multi-access points in the next step of our documentation process. We then began to structure our documentation for content reuse, converting long and sometimes meandering content into topic-based text, chunks that we could reuse across multiple pieces of content. We used variables for amounts and dates that would change frequently so that we could change it in one place and have it update in other places all at once. We linked outside sources of reliable information where it made sense to do so, instead of rewriting something that already existed in the internet. And we created templates of steps and information that we could reuse over and over again across our entire knowledge base when an interaction with a piece of software was exactly the same. We performed a documentation audit and began to build a catalog showing us where our gaps in knowledge were so that we could plan to bridge those gaps in the future. This catalog also started us down a path of wrapping our arms around all the documentation that our team was accountable for. This would set us up for success when the time came to approach our documentation's governance. Next step was to work through the process quadrant of the strategy, and we continued to add sections to our content catalog, defining the life cycle of each piece of documentation and noting what, if anything, that documentation was tied to when it came to requiring updates or deadlines for expiry. We added dates and team members who were responsible for those updates into the content catalog so that the updates were scheduled and wouldn't be missed. We removed the 12-step process that had previously existed. After all, nothing gates good content like too many steps along the way to publication. We examined who really needed to see and approve each piece of documentation, and we determined fairly quickly that we could shave off 9 of those steps. Our documentation would be written by our team of writers, reviewed by our internal tax analysts for accuracy, and then proof edited by one more member on our team as a critique. Moving forward, we were comfortable that only those 3 steps would be required. Lastly, we added Google Analytics tags and survey links into all of our documentation to capture and analyze metrics as soon as our content went live. We knew that metrics would be key to start seeing who was doing what with the changes that we were making. Next, we focused on delivery. As previously mentioned, we wanted to structure our documentation's delivery to users through a multitude of ways, empowering our internal and external users to find what they needed, when they needed it, in the manner they expected. Thanks to the work that we'd done during the planning and creation steps of our content strategy, we knew that we had 2 main delivery mechanisms to implement: Online Documentation Hub and in-application contextual help links. So we started by implementing our Online Documentation Hub. All of our documentation got moved into our newly selected cloud-based storage system, complete with security roles to control who could take down or put up documentation, and removing our dependency on other teams to update or release new content. By putting our content online, and by having done such a complete job of building our information architecture foundation around how we stored, organized, and presented that documentation, we also enabled searchability within that content hub, which was a feature that we'd heard loud and clear during discovery that was long overdue. Next, we implemented over 800 contextual links in our tax application, each one that linked out to a relevant piece of documentation housed within that online hub. As our delivery moved forward, we started monitoring both our Google Analytics results as well as our survey results, making us 100% more responsive to our users' needs and expectations. We expected that these metrics would help us identify where our planning and creation approaches had worked well and which of our delivery plans might need further adjustments. The metrics would be especially helpful coming out of the analytics from Google, determining which demographic of our users was interacting with our documentation in which way. The final step as we walked through systems design in creating the foundation of our content strategy was to establish our documentation's governance moving forward. We started by acting on the year-over-year task lists that we'd put into place when we built our content catalog, making sure that we didn't just throw documentation out into the world and then leave it there to gather dust. That included keeping an eye on other industry sources of tax knowledge, budgets that were coming out of the government agencies, and just making sure overall that our documentation matched what was being delivered through official tax channels. We aligned ourselves with other teams at H&R Block Canada to help drive a unified client experience across all of our company's documentation. We aligned ourselves with marketing to ensure that the language our team was using matched what our users might encounter in marketing collateral. We aligned ourselves with our tax analyst team so that as changes were made to a tax engine year over year, we'd be in the know and ready to update documentation at the same time. And we aligned ourselves with our user design team so that our documentation would match the look and feel of the digital software application. We continued to communicate internally that our team had full accountability for all of H&R Block Canada's technical documentation, explaining and demonstrating the foundation of the content strategy. We worked to make sure that what we were doing matched what other content creators were also doing across the enterprise. We were also able to use metrics to prioritize our documentation, spending our time refining articles where a high level of readership was found, and retiring articles that had low or no readership. We reviewed the click rate on our over 800 contextual links, and we were able to prioritize documentation on our most used software pages. We also kept an eye on making sure that our documentation stayed within industry best practice parameters around the length of time that someone would take to read a certain page. If the content was taking too long for users to read or to understand, we knew that we could do better. And with that, we'd completed the systems design foundation of our content strategy. So next up, we were ready to plan, create, deliver, and govern our content strategy from the content design perspective. We started by walking through the content design elements of content strategy, beginning with editorial. We outlined the mission for our documentation, which, in its very basic form, was to provide internal and external users with the help they needed when they needed it in order for everyone to be successful during tax season. We needed to know more about our audience, both internal and external, and we had a lot of questions that we were going to ask. For example, were they preparing their first ever tax return, or had they been preparing and filing online for years? Were they answering their first support call of the day as an internal user and feeling really energized? Or were they answering their 100th support call of the day and feeling really overwhelmed? Were our users younger people, very familiar with technology, but unfamiliar with taxes? Were they seniors? Perhaps they'd been filing taxes for years, but they were trying an online tax software for the very first time. What type of emotions did our users have, and how could we help to empathize with and moderate those emotions as they interacted with our product? What was their reading and comprehension level? What types of language did they want us to use? Did they expect us to use tax jargon, or would they prefer layman's terms? What type of voice and tone would they prefer? How did we straddle that line between being too friendly or too formal? What biases or mental models were coloring our users' behavior? As we asked and slowly planned to answer as many questions as possible, our next step, believe it or not, was to ask even more questions in order to start developing our content strategy from an experience perspective. What was a user doing when they wanted or needed documentation? Were they just starting a tax return? Were they right in the middle? Were they almost done? Were our support users looking to explain a new feature and release? Or were they trying to help somebody walk through our software? Was it a user's first time in our software? Was it their first time doing anything online at all? What type of device were they using? Were they using a mobile device, or were they using a desktop? What type of accessibility considerations should we put in place? There were a lot more questions than these ones, but in a nutshell, what we did in these two quadrants of content strategy was ask and learn as much as possible about our users, and not just as numbers or metrics coming into our application, but as humans, as individual people who are interacting with us. With the number of questions that we uncovered in the planning step, we had to start doing user research in order to answer as many questions as we could. After analyzing the existing metrics and demographic segments that we did have available to us, we started to create some user journeys. There were several broad categories that we explored for our external users: 18 to 35 who were familiar with tech but unfamiliar with taxes, 35 to 60 who were familiar with taxes and tech, or 60 plus who were familiar with taxes but less familiar with tech. Additionally, there were two major categories that we explored with our internal users: either brand new H&R Block team members or multi-year returning H&R Block team members. And even though the demographic segments between our internal and external users were different in many ways, we discovered that they shared a lot in common when it came to their emotional needs, their preferences, and their expectations of our documentation. So for the editorial component of our strategy, we were able to consider them as a whole. For example, we knew that all of our users wanted us to speak to them, not at them, as friendly and knowledgeable tax experts. As a product that was being put into the marketplace under the H&R Block Canada brand, our users expected our documentation to show a certain level of professionalism and seniority, given that we had been doing taxes for Canadians for over 50 years, but also be conversational. Given the complex and stressful nature of taxes, all of our users were already under a certain level of cognitive overload, and we knew that and kept that top of mind. So it was important that our documentation did everything it could to reduce that load and speak to a user in the most appropriate manner possible. Many of our users also had existing mental models in place when they interacted with our product and our documentation. In essence, they were bringing with them a certain expectation that they had based on their interactions with perhaps another competitor's software in our industry, or with other aspects of the H&R Block Canada brand in the past. So it was up to us to make sure that we matched those models as closely as possible, avoiding any additional cognitive load or stress. Our documentation really needed to meet users where they stood. Industry best practice told us that documentation should meet but not exceed a grade 7 comprehension level for both internal and our external audience. And so as we created documentation, we ran it through readability and scannability tests to ensure that we were maintaining that baseline. We also created a style guide to document the learnings about our audience and our decisions about the style choices that we were using in our documentation. We did some basic user testing with a few pieces of documentation, each with a different flavor of our writing style, to gauge whether or not we were hitting the mark. Thanks to several really quick A/B studies, we found out how friendly was too friendly and how formal was too formal. So we were able to iterate and adjust again and again. Next, we tackled documentation formats. Once again, thanks to our work in the systems design piece of the content strategy quad, we knew that our users were interacting with us primarily via desktop, not so much on mobile device. So our focus would be to prioritize our documentation as such. We asked what formats our documentation needed to take to support users during their top tasks of preparing their tax returns, and we realized that we had a few goals that we wanted to help them achieve. We wanted to help onboard our users. We looked to industry best practice, and we knew that videos are hugely popular for onboarding and tutorial learning. In fact, as of 2016, YouTube was the second most popular social network in existence. So we figured all of those people can't be wrong. We created some video tutorials to help familiarize our users within the application. Video is also a really great choice because it can help alleviate stressful feelings for users when it conveys both verbal and non-verbal cues, helping users feel more relaxed. So with that in mind, we made short animated videos that were fun, positive, enticing. They had up-to-beat music, brightly colored screen grabs, easy to follow instructions. So they tied our brand and our user experience in our software to all of those positive emotions. We also wanted to provide users with really detailed documentation where they could find all the information that they needed as they worked through the software. So we wrote chunked, topic-based, well-organized help articles that used and explained tax jargon, included screen grabs of the software itself, incorporated jump links for easy navigation, had lots of white space, and provided samples and examples of actual tax calculations. We also linked out from our documentation to other reputable sources of tax knowledge and information, such as government agencies, in order to demonstrate the reliability of our brand that our brand was up to date with the goings-on around us in the fast-moving industry. We also wanted to provide users with the ability to download something if they wanted, to feel or to really touch some piece of our documentation if they had that need, to have something tangible in their hands as they navigated the software if they had that desire. So we created brightly colored, clearly laid out PDF quick start guides that were easily downloaded and printed, and that had sufficient white space on them to allow users to actually write and make their own notes if that's what they wanted to do. All of these instances where our internal and external users had crossover documentation needs were great, but we still had one unique need for our internal users that didn't cross over, and that was our release notes. Our internal user base needed access to release notes each time a new version of our software went out the door. After several collaborative working sessions with the support team, we discovered what they actually wanted, and that was language that they could use to explain new features and releases to customers, and the ability to see at a glance without sorting through what had come out in each release cycle. So we created a detailed, albeit somewhat cumbersome spreadsheet as a starting point. It was color-coded by product, it was sortable, it was filterable and searchable, and we put it in the cloud so that it was secure and available only to a login environment. We knew that it wasn't ideal, but it was somewhere to start. With the planning and creation behind us, it was time to deliver. So we launched our fully based cloud documentation hub using our very carefully crafted voice and tone. We strove to speak to our users, but not at them. And we followed corporate brand guidelines so that our documentation looked the same as our company's marketing collateral. We delivered animated videos with subtitles and scripts for accessibility, printable PDF quick start guides, in-application contextual help links, and thousands of cloud-based articles organized according to our previously crafted information architecture principle. We made sure that all the documentation had clear headings for scannability, white space for ease of reading, jump links for navigation, font style and size that would accommodate both online or downloadable use. We did some additional user testing on our content as well, iterating and iterating and iterating again. We continue to experiment with our tone, working to get it just right. We asked ourselves questions like, at what level did too much formality maybe contribute to additional cognitive load? Or at what point would too much friendliness reduce the trustworthiness of our content? Did the tone that we were using meet and match our users' existing mental models, or did it cause confusion and maybe some distrust in the documentation? During every single test we did, we learned a little bit more, and it helped us get our documentation better and better every time. And thanks to the work that we've done during the systems design strategy build out, we were already set up to collect metrics and feedback from our entire user base. We didn't specifically look to our Google Analytics feedback for our editorial and experience content strategy quad results, but we did find that the survey feedback was really useful when it came to understanding if we were meeting our users' experience and editorial needs. That format of free-form user feedback allowed our users to tell us what we needed to hear and helped us move towards the goal of getting the documentation just right. So it was now time to turn our attention to governance. Thanks to analytics, we could much more easily keep an eye on who was accessing documentation, from where, how, what were they doing with it. And we could see trends that were coming down in the marketplace, like a slow move towards more mobile devices, or the growth in the number of millennials that were starting to enter the tax preparation market. Being able to clearly see and track these trends would help us get ahead of the curve and adjust our documentation accordingly now and into the future. We also used our metrics to adjust our continually evolving style guide. We knew that our voice would not change. We would always be the voice of H&R Block Canada, but our tone could be adjusted based on what our users were telling us through that survey feedback. We learned that in some instances, users wanted a more conversational tone, still professional and knowledgeable, but maybe a little less stiff than what we had implemented originally. In other instances, we saw that some of our users were getting more and more experienced with taxes and more comfortable with our software. So these users might expect that our documentation would hold their hand a little less and give them more tax theory and more tax knowledge. We also started to lean into accessibility considerations, learning more about both physical and cognitive disabilities that Canadians have. We knew that we needed to do more and to do better when it came to accommodating as many people who might interact with our documentation as possible. We started by finding some online tools that we could use to simulate dyslexia, visual impairments, the use of adaptive technology, and we tested our documentation against those. We know that we have a lot more to do with accessibility in the future, but it felt good to know that we have it on the roadmap. And so after all that strategizing and with the content out in the wild, tax season came and went, and it was time to see how we had done. It was so exciting to see that our content strategy was working. In fact, in that first year alone, we successfully reduced calls to the support center by 70% and moved to a process where creating technical documentation only required 3 steps instead of 12. Both of these things were a huge win for our clients, for our support team, and for proving that there was value to the work that our team was doing. The addition of over 800 inline documentation links from our tax application enhanced the delivery of the documentation to all our clients. And the publication of documentation into an online cloud-based hub enabled that much sought-after search functionality while removing our dependency on other teams to update and publish content. Adding analytics meant that we knew who was doing what and when with documentation, which enabled us to better establish governance and to know that we could be more responsive for users today and in the days to come. Now, as I'm sure you all know, content strategy is not a one and done endeavor. Over the past 5 years, our team has continued to iterate on and evolve our strategy to meet the changes in our company and the shifts in industry, as well as to do our best to keep up with industry standards and the best practices of the discipline in technical documentation. Thanks to our team's ongoing work with our technical documentation content strategy, we've seen even more gains. In fact, our team now manages all the documentation for 4 digital products bilingually available to thousands of tax pros and millions of Canadians every year. To date, our team has seen additional gains of over 3,400 writer and translator hours and almost $70,000 in savings. The tighter and more comprehensive we can make our content strategy, the more that we know our team can contribute to the success of all of our clients and the H&R Block Canada brand. So that was a lot. As you can see, and as you all no doubt suspected and knew, there's a lot of work that goes into creating a content strategy, more than most people realize. Not only do you have to consider all 4 steps of documentation creation strategy, but you have to fold them into each section of the content strategy quad. You have to ask as many questions as you can. You have to do as much research as you can. You need to investigate all your options, pursue different opportunities, and iterate as often as possible. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. Sometimes you'll try something and your user base will say thanks, but no thanks. Or sometimes you'll put a great strategy into place only to have to pivot because of changes in the industry or your organization or even the world around you. But sometimes you'll make a decision and you'll implement an element of strategy and discover that you've made enormous gains. And moments like those are what make all the hard work that goes into building a strategy like this worthwhile. Content strategy doesn't happen overnight. Depending on the size of your organization, the size of your team, budget considerations, timelines, competing priorities, and a host of other factors, developing and implementing a content strategy can take anywhere from a few months to a number of years, and it's not meant to be a static plan. It's not something that you do once and you just move on. You just have to get started and then keep your strategy moving forward and evolving as you go. A good content strategy, in fact, is always in flux. It should be adjusted as user needs and journeys change. It should be adapted as the needs and priorities of an organization changes. It's a living, iterative thing. Just like documentation shouldn't be published and then left to gather dust, a content strategy shouldn't be created and then just left to sit. Accessibility, usability, inclusivity, readability, industry best practices, all those things are always evolving and changing, and your content strategy should too. So the last hard question is, how do you get buy-in? And the honest answer is that it can be really hard. In most cases, there are a lot of loud voices involved when you plan the strategy of anything, and enterprise content strategy is no exception. I've found varying measures of success by focusing my efforts on two specific areas: finding common ground and collaboration. The first area where you might find success is looking for common ground with people at all levels in your organization. Everyone knows that the user is the key to everything in business. A happy user means a thriving business. So look for common ground with other stakeholders in your company that focuses on user success. Communicate the fact that a well-defined strategy will help your company keep all of your users happy, and then work together to figure out what that strategy could look like. The second area where you might find alignment and buy-in is in collaboration. Good documentation and a robust content strategy cannot happen successfully in a vacuum. So you want to collaborate with everyone at your company who touches content. Work with people that share your passion for good documentation. Team up with them and drive a comprehensive strategy that includes all the work they're doing and all the work that you're doing. Share your enthusiasm, show your knowledge, and speak to the fact that everyone is working towards this common goal. So that's it. I'd like to thank a few people without whom we would never have had the success that I was able to share with you all today in creating and implementing and continuing to create, implement, and evolve our content strategy. Specifically, my team of amazing writers and translators, as well as everyone at H&R Block Canada who really supported us as we proposed our ideas and implemented our plans. And last but certainly not least, I would just like to take a moment to thank Madcap and everyone here today who joined us. Your time is really valuable and we acknowledge that. So I really appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with me. This last slide is just a short list of resources that I referenced today and also that I reference on a regular basis, some websites, some books. They are all invaluable to me. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jen.
Great. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I was hanging on every word. Wonderful job. I have just one thing I want to mention. We do have some fun questions that have come in that I'm looking forward to sharing with everybody and having you comment on. But just for everybody's awareness, we do have a great promotion on the Madcap Authoring and Management System through the end of August, where you can save looks like almost about $70 on your monthly subscription. So it's a great way to get in on the bundle of products, including Flare, Central, plugins to the other ecosystems that we support, like Zendesk, Salesforce, ServiceNow, at a really great rate. So there's going to be a link where you can learn more about it, of course, when you get the deck. But please contact us directly, sales@madcapsoftware.com, or contact your rep. Contact me. We're happy to answer any questions about it if you're not already on this and you're interested in taking advantage of the savings. It's a great way to get everything at a much more economical price per month. So what I'm going to do, we have some questions coming in. I think we've got just that question slide up. Perfect. I want to just throw out a few in our last few minutes here, Adriana, because one question has come up because I think everybody's quite impressed with this transformation that you went through. Can you speak a little bit about kind of how long did it take to kind of go through this overhaul? I know you're still in this, iterative process and you haven't stopped, but that initial sort of transformation, about how long did it take from start to finish for your team?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that the important component of that is that we're still not done. You know,
Mm,
that's the beauty of content and content strategy is really to do it while you never finish because you're always investigating what your users are doing, how they're changing, what they needed yesterday, they may not need today. That initial piece of work that my team underwent was roughly 6 months or so, where we changed the process of how many steps it took to write documentation. We implemented an online hub that was searchable, and we added contextual help links into the application. So that was roughly, yeah, six months or so was for that initial piece, and then the iteration just, I mean, is 5 and a bit years and counting now.
wow, that's amazing. One question that I had, and I think a couple other folks too, you mentioned that survey where you were really taking a look at what your customers thought,
Hmm.
you know, that proactive comment. Can you talk a little bit about how you designed that? Like, how did you design, like, what was sort of that's something that you built in-house? Was it a third-party survey? Can you talk a little bit about the mechanics of that, and how you integrated it to your outputs?
Yeah, absolutely. So this survey, there's tons of great survey tools out there. In the moment, we use SurveyMonkey because we had access to them and to their platform for other things. And
Hmm.
so it was a very simple survey. We wanted to keep it simple because if a user opens the link to the survey and they see 30 questions and long
Yeah.
form answers, they're going to shake their head and say, forget it.
Hmm.
So we kept it really, really simple. All we wanted to know was, did this answer your question and then tell us more, and that was it. And we found that users that were invested in the content and in the documentation were really happy to tell us more, and we got a ton of valuable feedback around voice and tone, style, accessibility, all of those sort of editorial and experience perspective viewpoints. That's
Hmm.
really where we captured that information.
Pretty cool. And when you were talking initially about the steps that you reduced, you went from 12, you reduced it down. Did you guys also find that you were able to reduce some tool chain, you know, some tools as well to keep things a bit more streamlined and integrated? Were you able to sort of realize some savings there?
Yeah, so when we first reduced the process around the steps that went on, it wasn't so much a tool saving as it was a manpower saving or a woman power saving.
Hmm.
The reason being is there were so many people that were involved in the publication of a new piece of content or in the review of an existing piece of content. So many people touched that documentation, and of course, all of those touches were hours spent by those people that could perhaps have been redirected into their area of a focus of expertise if it wasn't actually writing the content. So we didn't so much see a savings in tools immediately when we reduced those steps, but we did see a huge savings in terms of the amount of hours that went into each piece. And of course, we need to be responsive during tax season. Things change really fast, and 12 steps was not
Hmm.
responsive.
Right. Yeah. Right. Um, you know, it was interesting how you started integrating some more multimedia into the written word, right, to augment what you're doing there. Were you guys responsible for creating that content, or did you work with other departments for those videos that you were hosting on YouTube? How did that play out?
Yeah, we actually created the videos ourselves. I have a spectacularly talented group of people who work with me, and it was our technical writer and myself who created those videos. And we just use really simple tools that are available in the marketplace. We wanted them to be really short. We wanted to be kind of punchy and fun, and really focused around the fact that the idea of cognitive fluency is if somebody feels like something is going to be easy, and if something looks like it's going to be easy, then they assume that it will be easy. So we wanted those videos to be short and easy and fun and really positive and upbeat. And we were lucky enough that we were able to make them in-house. I had the talent on my team, and put them into YouTube.
That's great. So these are publicly available then, right? So are they
Yes,
on a private channel? Okay, great. Very cool.
yes.
Kind of two more questions, I think, before we wrap. I'm looking at the time, but please keep the questions coming, folks, because if we don't get to it live, we will be following up. But I'm trying to pick out ones that multiple folks are asking, which is, you have a team of folks. What do you have any quick advice? If you're a lone writer, and maybe not, having those other team members and resources, do you have any tips that you can provide on avoiding any kind of, process overload to do this kind of overhaul? Maybe if you're a team of 1 or 2.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have been a team of 1 as well in my past life, not with H&R Block, but elsewhere. So I'm definitely familiar with some of the challenges that go into being a team of 1.
Mhm.
I would say start small. One of the expressions that my team and I use is try not to boil the ocean.
Mm.
It's you don't want to bite off more than you can chew, and there's a lot of things you can do building out a content strategy that are super effective, but they're not um, maybe not as robust or as time consuming as what I walked through today. So I would say sort of pick a few areas where you really want to focus on, whether it's process, whether it's a tool, make sure that you're working as efficiently as you can. And that's actually something I know you mentioned we'd be sending out questions at the end of the presentation, maybe as part of the deck. Hard to explain that one really sufficiently in a couple of
Mm.
minutes. I'd be happy to kind of address that one further in the recording that goes out.
Perfect. Yeah. And I think one last one, you mentioned you're looking to improve accessibility, but could you kind of share with us one thing about, if you were to look into the future and you're iterating, what are some of the things you're working towards in the future in addition to that improved accessibility? Or perhaps are you looking at, maximizing search potential or using micro content? I'm wondering what the team is thinking about for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Search is huge. We know that users want to search and find what they need, and we know that users do not search the same way as the person sitting right next to them. A user could be using our software in exactly the same way and still look for something in a completely different manner. So accessibility is huge, search is huge, and of course metrics, getting more metrics, better metrics, looking into those metrics even further, diving into that data. All of those 3 things really just tell us what our users are doing, who they are, and what they need. And as long as we can kind of keep our finger on the pulse of who our users are, what they need, we are able to then make sure that our documentation meets those needs.
Fantastic. Great. Well, I'm looking at the time. I want to be respectful of everyone because we're all in different time zones here. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. This was so informative. I hope everybody on the call has appreciated this because I know that's some great information and things to be thinking about. So thanks again, Adriana, for joining us. This was wonderful.
My
Again, so
pleasure.
yeah, an outstanding job. Yeah. So thanks everybody for joining. We hope you enjoyed this. Again, we will be sending out a link to the webinar as soon as we're done and the video is rendered, and we will be following up with the detailed question and answer document. So thanks everybody for staying engaged and for all of your great questions. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and hope to see you on the next webinar. So thanks again.